welcome back to my channel. So for my second vlog, I thought I would go ahead and do a language learning vlog because that is one of the questions that I get most frequently after things like, bullet journaling and lettering and that kind of stuff. So what I decided to do was I have structured this kind of in 4 different segments, if you will. And so I will do time stamps down at the bottom. So if you want to jump around to different sections, go ahead and look in the description box and you'll have the different timestamps down there. So to give you an idea, I thought of kind of 4 different sections that I'm going to talk about. So the first is, how do I choose a language? The second is, how have I learned different languages? The third is, what am I doing currently to learn languages? And this is also going to incorporate my language journal, which is something that I teased a little bit on my Instagram feed a while ago. The last one is going to be various tips. Now, I am in no way an expert, but I have been studying languages off and on for most of my life, so I can let you guys know what I've kind of figured out. Again, take everything with a grain of salt. Also, the way that I learn and the way that I study might not be the way that you learn and that you study, but you never know, you might find something that you hadn't thought about before and what have you. But definitely if you have more questions, there's so much information online. Definitely feel free to do some Googling and you will find probably way more in-depth stuff than I will be giving you guys here today. But just in case, let's get started. So in this first section, I'm going to talk about how I choose languages. So the first couple of languages that I studied, specifically ASL and Spanish, both had to do with exposure. So with ASL, it had to do with being exposed to deaf students in my school and thinking it would be really cool to be able to communicate with them. And Spanish was more of I live in the US and there are a lot of people who speak Spanish here, so the chances seem, whether or not that's true, the chances seemed much higher that I would run into somebody who spoke Spanish in my daily life than somebody who spoke German or French, which were 2 of the other languages that we offered at my school. So those 2 languages I definitely kind of chose by default, if you will. I tried to pick languages that seemed practical and that I would have a reason to use, and also because I had to fulfill requirements for school. So once I got into college and I was no longer being required to take a foreign language because I was already a language major, so I studied ASL in university, which meant that I took ASL and interpreting classes throughout college, so that was not an issue. At that point, after having been in university for a year or 2, I decided that I wanted to learn another language, and so it was my choice. Nobody was imposing it on me. And so if you guys saw my first vlog, you'll know that the way that I chose my next language, which was Arabic, was a little bit random. I'll try and keep it shorter this time, but basically I really wanted to learn Hindi. However, my university didn't offer it. And so I decided that since Hindi also had a different writing system, it would be interesting to pick a different language that had another writing system. And the reason that I chose Arabic as opposed to Russian or Japanese, for example, which my university did offer, was that there was this link between Hindi and Urdu, where Urdu is a language spoken in India, but that uses the Arabic alphabet. So that was kind of the way that I chose it there. So again, I was kind of constrained by what my school actually offered, but I had a language in mind that I wanted to do, and I was going to study a language no matter what, so I figured out a way to pick a language kind of from that starting point, if you will. After that, let's see, what language did I study next? Oh, so I did study Japanese. There's an institution, it's Boston Language Institute, if I remember, and they do private language classes, and they've got a whole bunch of different languages. And so rewind a little bit, back in the era where I was really into Bollywood, which was high school, I was also really into Japanese and manga and anime and all of that kind of stuff. And so I had always wanted to kind of study Japanese, but I don't know why I didn't in university. I don't know why I immediately went to Arabic. I don't know. Anyway, so it was always one of those that was kind of in the back of my mind. I really liked the language. I liked listening to it. And so one summer I was working and, didn't have classes, and I decided that I would sign up for a Japanese class. And that one was one that I had, this connection to the language back from when I was in high school and decided to go ahead and try it. Unfortunately, it was only like a 12-week class or something like that, so we didn't learn the writing, we didn't learn any of the alphabets. We learned everything Romanized, and I've forgotten most of it, which is really sad, but I wasn't able to continue because then I went back to school and I had work and all that kind of stuff. So that was the next one. Basically now, whenever I want to learn a new language, I pick something that is both something that I have like an emotional connection to for whatever reason, and I picked something that's going to be practical. So French was probably my next language that I really did, and that was because one, I wanted to move to France, and two, I had already decided back, I don't know at what point, but I had already decided that I wanted to focus on the Romance languages first. I kind of wanted to have all of the Romance languages, like collect them all or whatever. So since I already had Spanish, I thought that, okay, well, I want to move to France, so obviously French is going to be the next step. Let's do that one. Then while I was living in France, I started studying Italian on my own, and that was one that I had been to Italy. I wanted to, round out the Romance languages. I really liked the sound of Italian. It made a lot of sense to me because I already spoke Spanish and French at that point, so that was kind of where it went from there. And yeah, so I've been studying that one off and on for a while. Not making as much progress as I'd like to, but it's going. And the latest one, so here's the other thing you need to know. The invention of Duolingo was both great and awful because I find it really helpful. It's definitely not like the be-all end-all for language learning. However, it is really useful for learning vocabulary and just kind of getting exposure, practicing conjugations and all that kind of stuff. It is useful. The problem that I have is I don't really play games on my phone. Like, I know there are some people who really like, Candy Crush or Solitaire, and at various points in my life I have played those as well. But once Duolingo came out, I basically treated it like a game on my phone. And I haven't checked in a while, so don't quote me on this. But if I recall, I think I've started, not finished, but started between like 8 and 13 different languages on Duolingo. So I've got French, Spanish, Italian, German, Greek, Hebrew, Korean. I think I've done Dutch and Romanian, but they might have deleted those. Polish, Russian. Like literally, I'll just be like, oh my gosh, that looks so cool. Let's start that one. And I'll do like three or four levels. I'll get up to level 2 or whatever. And then I'll stop. And so I've done that with a ton of languages. I don't speak most of these languages, obviously, but I do it for fun because just languages really interest me, and it's something that I love doing. So Duolingo has kind of ruined me for that, but I'm going to focus more on the stuff that I've actually kind of stuck with a little bit more, if you will. And I apologize if this is like all over the place because that's just kind of the way that I say languages, if you guys can't tell. So Italian was one that I worked on, that I have been working on my own. And then the latest one that I'm doing is obviously Korean. So I did do a video with my Korean notebook, and I will kind of show you guys a little bit with that, and I will eventually do an update on that. But Korean is the next language that I'm working on. And that one was actually kind of funny because I've always been really interested in Japanese, right? Like, that was kind of the thing, that was the language that I was really into when I was in high school, and I always thought that if I ever studied kind of an Eastern Asian language that wasn't Hindi, it was going to be Japanese. That was just kind of what I always figured. I figured that, between Korean and Chinese and Japanese, like Japanese was going to be the one, right? However, a friend of mine over the summer got really obsessed with K-dramas. And so I think she really just wanted somebody else to share the obsession with. And so she was like, hey, Caitlin, you should try watching one. And I was like, sure, why not? Like, I love watching stuff with subtitles. Like, let's go for it. So she introduced me to a series, and the first series I ever watched was Suspicious Partner. And so I only ever watched it with her. So, she would come over, we'd like make dinner, and then we'd go and we'd sit and we watch like an episode or two of Suspicious Partner. So it took a while for us to get through. But, and at first I was like, yeah, I like this. Like, definitely there's some things that are very different from like the style of TV that you see in the US and even in like Spain and in France and whatever. So there are definitely some different things that like at first I was like, I don't really understand this. And like sometimes the translations that they do for the subtitles are just really amusing. Like, so, I was watching this and I was like, yeah, I like this show, but like wasn't quite at that like obsession point yet. So I was like, okay. So at some point, I think we're like halfway through the series, and I was getting kind of impatient. Like, I was starting to get to the point where I was like, well, I really want to know what happens, but this is like the show that we watched together, which is ridiculous because she had already watched the show and she was rewatching it because, side note, she has a rule that we can't watch anything together that she hasn't already seen because I talk constantly. this is probably a good thing for her to have done. Anyway, so that was the reason why we were watching the show, was because she had already watched it and she like knew what was happening. So if I talked through it, it wasn't going to be a big deal. But the problem was, once I start watching a show with somebody, I feel like I have to continue watching that show with that person. So I was kind of going through, and she had told me a couple of other dramas that she was like, yeah, these, I think you might like these, because she also knows that I won't watch anything that has a truly, truly tragic ending. Just like, don't even ask me to, because I won't. And so I will spoil things for myself. I know this is going to be an unpopular opinion, but it is what it is. So she had given me a couple of other shows that I had planned on watching eventually if I, got into K-dramas basically. And so I chose, what did I pick for my second one? I think I watched Descendants of the Sun as my second show. And it was just kind of completely random. I don't even remember why I chose that particular show. And I like couldn't stop watching. And that one, like that particular show marked the point where like, obviously I really like Suspicious Partner and I'm currently rewatching it now that I understand more Korean to try and like pick up different things. But I obviously really like that show, but Descendants of the Sun was the one that like got me hooked kind of thing. And after that, I have pretty much since then had a show going at any given point in time, like at least one show. So, I kind of had this like slow fall and then it kind of snowballed. And so while I was watching, I was never like, at no point initially was like, yeah, I'm gonna learn Korean. Like that seems like a thing I should do. No, I was just like, no, I really like K-dramas. Like this seems fun. Why not? And I don't know, at some point I reached a point where I was like, one, I'm starting to recognize a couple of things. Like I'm kind of recognizing some words, and my friend was starting to learn Korean on her own, so she would like explain certain things. And so I was getting like this, secondhand information from her, plus I was watching a lot of shows, and so I was picking up on different things. And there was a certain point when I was like I can't. Like I need to start learning Korean, because this just, if I'm gonna keep watching these shows, I'm not gonna be able to resist. Like it has to happen. So I basically caved. I initially was like, no, I'm not gonna learn Korean, I'm just gonna watch the shows and it'll be fine, but eventually I'm gonna go back to learning Japanese, because over the summer I actually bought a book to learn hiragana, and so I was working on learning hiragana over the summer, and then once I started with the K-dramas, I completely stopped that, because I was like, well, this is a whole other different alphabet, I have to learn Hangul and everything, like, I'm not gonna try and do both at the same time. And so Korean was the language that like snuck up on me. I didn't expect to ever really be learning it, but now I'm obsessed and I love it. Like literally Korean is kind of taking over. And that's the way it happens for me. I need to have some kind of a connection to the language in order to actually continue it. That was probably long enough on the how do I choose languages. So how exactly have I learned languages? So just to kind of go back through the languages that I've studied, you guys probably have realized I learned ASL either through after-school clubs where we would have interpreters who would come in and kind of, teach us the manual alphabet, teach us how to present ourselves, that was a Frenchism right there, how to introduce ourselves, and various vocabulary, making sentences and all of that kind of stuff, followed by official classes both in high school and in university. Spanish, I did classes in high school, so I did 4 years of classes in high school. I did a semester in university, and then I also spent 2 years in country. So at that point, it had been 5 years since I had studied Spanish, basically. And I, obviously I'd studied it for long enough that certain things were still in my brain, but I also had to relearn a lot of stuff. So I focused mostly on speaking. So my spoken Spanish, I would say, is a bit stronger than both my written Spanish and like my reading comprehension, for example. I spent a lot of time speaking to people. I had friends who were Spanish. I, watched TV, I listened to music and all that kind of stuff. So I would say that Spanish overall, I'm much stronger orally than I am in written form. And once I moved to Spain, I actually never took Spanish classes. I just kind of got it through exposure. I did, however, study for my DELE, which is basically a certification of your Spanish level. So we use the European standard, which is the A1, A2, B1, B2, C1, C2. And so I did get a book to help me study for that exam, because there's a listening section, a speaking section, a writing section, and a reading section. I think there's only the 4 sections. So I did get basically a book to help me study for that, because I just had never really taken tests like that before. But aside from that, I didn't actually take any Spanish classes. So next up was Arabic. Arabic, I also studied in formal classes. I took 3 semesters in university, and I also did a summer study abroad in Cairo where we had classes in the morning with a teacher, and then we had excursions and stuff in the afternoon. So that one was like a pretty official study thing. I haven't studied really since university. I did actually have a private tutor for a little while. The only problem was she had a young kid and I was working in the afternoons and evenings with my job, and so it just got to the point where our schedules didn't work out, so I had to stop taking classes with her, which was unfortunate, but that was basically the last like official thing I've done for Arabic. And honestly, every once in a while I try and revise like vocabulary and stuff on my own, but I really I think I need a little bit more time in class with more of a structured environment for Arabic, just because it is so different from any other language that I've ever done, and I don't really have a lot of exposure to it otherwise. But yeah. Next is, let's see, I did about a month of Japanese, so that was in a small group setting. I think there were like 8 of us, maybe, give or like 8 or 10 of us. So small group setting. It was a very short class. I only did it for about 12 weeks. But again, kind of a more focused on conversation than on writing, because in that short of a time period, there was no way we were going to learn hiragana, katakana, and like some kanji. It just wasn't going to happen. So it was mostly focusing on speaking and all that kind of stuff. I've forgotten most of it because that was the only Japanese class that I ever did. And then lately, it's been mostly self-study. So oh, actually, no, that's a lie. Next up is French. So French, I actually did classes through the Alliance Française, so it's small class sizes as well. I think probably my smallest class was like 5 people and the biggest was like 12. So it kind of depended on the level and, you know, how many people they had signing up. And we had native French teachers, which was great. And actually, that's something that I've been really lucky throughout all of my language learning experiences, where I've had native teachers, I think, for every single language I've ever studied. If I studied in a classroom setting, I always had native teachers, which I know is not always the case, and I'm very, very grateful for that, because I think that I think it was really good, especially just getting exposure to the language. You know, you get exposed to the language from the teacher, and it's really nice to have somebody who is a native speaker being your language model. Anyway, lost my train of thought. Right, French. So, I took classes through there, so basically structured, but again, focusing a lot on speaking. We did do some writing, not a ton, but honestly, my main goal was to be able to speak it, because I was moving to France, and I also needed to be able to write a letter of motivation, but like nothing super crazy or anything like that. And actually, French is the language that I have studied more. It's probably the language that I've studied the most in depth in terms of like academic study. So once I was in France, my second year, I did a DELF course. So basically, like the Spanish course, it's a certification class. So it was French classes, but with this idea that they prepare you for this exam at the end of the school year, basically. And so I had a grammar class. We had a speaking class, so like either actually speaking or listening to texts and answering questions, that kind of stuff. And then we had a reading and writing comprehension class. And so that was really helpful, because I had basically taken classes up through an A2 level, which is like upper beginner, when I was still in the US, and then I had moved to France, and I had just been living here and trying to, speak and whatever, but I didn't have as solid of a base as I had in, for example, Spanish when I then moved to Spain. So it was really helpful for me to, review a lot of those grammar rules with the grammar class, to have a teacher to correct my writing, to have more like focused speaking opportunities in class. And, it was really very helpful. And especially since the following year, I ended up signing up for a master's. So that one was interesting. Luckily, because I was going for my master's in teaching, specifically teaching English, about half of our classes were in our discipline, which meant that they were actually taught in English. So that was nice, because it was long days of classes, and the days where I had all class in French were it was very exhausting. And I feel bad for a lot of my classmates who were French. I imagine it was just as exhausting for them to have classes all day in English. So we flip-flopped on that one. So that was interesting because that was a lot of like academic level French, and I wasn't with other, you know, foreigners learning French. I was with French people in French university, and that one was definitely like, that was kind of a quick learning curve there where I had to get comfortable listening to, you know, 3-hour long lectures in French. So definitely good experience. This year I'm also doing my master's again, and actually this year everything is in French because we no longer have those kinds of disciplinary classes. So all of this stuff is like theoretical, has to do with like administration and just stuff that's just done in French. So I have 2 days a week where basically I'm just around French all the time. So I would have to say that my academic French is stronger than my academic Spanish, for one thing. My written French is stronger than my written Spanish. The thing that I'm really lacking in French is that I don't have a lot of like the slang and the colloquial expressions, which talking to people my age, talking to colleagues is not a big deal. However, once I get into classes, I don't always know what all the kids are talking about because they use words that I have never heard of in my life. So that's definitely something that I'm trying to work on, and I carpool with French people, and it's really great because if a word comes up, I can ask them and be like, hey, what does this mean? So I'm getting a little bit more of that vocabulary, but I'm not as immersed in French in the same way that I was in Spanish, whereas in Spanish I have a lot more slang vocabulary. I mean, granted, it's, you know, 8 years old at this point, but still, like at some point I had a lot more of like conversational Spanish, whereas now I have now my French is more, you know, for my professional life. I work in a French school, and so I have to be able to talk to everyone in administration, all of my colleagues, all that kind of stuff. So it's definitely a very different usage for the language. French was the last one that I really learned officially in class. Italian was the first language that I started basically from scratch, if you will. I had never officially taken any classes. However, I wouldn't say that I didn't understand anything because I did already speak Spanish and French. And that was the first language that I really relied on online resources to kind of fuel my study. When I was looking for resources, I came across this YouTuber, Lucrezia. She has Learn Italian with Lucrezia, and it's awesome. She has so many videos. She has some that are more explanatory videos where she explains like certain like differences between these two things or certain vocabulary, and a lot of it's in English and she's really clear to follow. But she also has like vlogs and shorter videos that are specifically in Italian, and she'll slow down. She's actually also recently started a podcast, which I need to start listening to more. So I relied heavily on her videos when I was going through, just for listening practice and to understand certain grammatical points and all that kind of stuff. I also found a couple of artists that I really like in Italian that I listen to music in Italian, when I'm out for walks and that kind of stuff. So I really enjoy, I think probably my favorite artist in Italian at this point is Annalisa, and I listen to a couple of her albums on repeat, so to the point that I can like sing along and I understand more of the lyrics. Now doing my studies this way, I don't have as much of that exposure to speaking because I don't have a language partner in person in Italian. I have had experiences where I can like type with somebody and we'll text back and forth in Italian, and so that is helpful, but I'm not getting that spoken practice, which is what I would really like to have. But otherwise, like that one, I would say Italian was pretty easy for me to pick up just because I did already have the base with other Romance languages, and so a lot of the grammar points just made sense to me at this point. Korean, on the other hand, I'm doing on my own, and I don't really have any sort of like points of reference. And so if I have questions, I ask my friend who's been studying more, and she's also more of like a grammar focused person, so she can explain that kind of grammar stuff, whereas I won't even look it up because I just don't really care. Not that I don't care. Reading about that information is not how it gets into my brain. I need to use it many times, and then eventually I will like work out the rule on my own, and I'll just know kind of how to use it, which, yeah. So if I have any specific questions, I can ask her. I've been using Talk to Me in Korean, which is an app and also a website. They've got YouTube channels, like all that kind of stuff. I've just been focusing on their curriculum, so starting at, level 1, lesson 1, and working my way through because it's structured really nicely. I really enjoy the lessons. They're not too long. I think the longest one's like 20 minutes. Most of the time they're anywhere between like 5 and 15. So they're really nice, like bite-sized lessons. I also listen to, or I watch a bunch of K-dramas, so I get the language exposure that way, and I'm starting to get to a level, still very basic, but I'm getting to a level where I can actually pick out certain words, and I've learned certain grammar points and I can hear them when I'm listening to the K-dramas, so that's actually been really helpful. But again, I'm not really getting as much speaking just because I don't have a Korean person that I can talk to, and my friend and I are both like, she definitely can speak more than I can, but it's also one of those things where we're so used to speaking in English that it's just really awkward for us to like, I don't know, it feels kind of artificial. So at some point I will look into probably a tutor or something like that, but not for now. So I kind of mushed my part 2 and my part 3. So basically, I'm going to try and keep part 3 a little bit shorter and just show you guys what I'm actually doing right now. So you guys know I speak Spanish and French. I've been studying Italian for a while. I'm working on Korean right now, and I'd also like to work on Arabic. So those are kind of, well, and also ASL. So those are kind of my big languages that I have been working on and that I would like to keep working on. So what am I doing to kind of keep those up? So first off, in French, because I live in France, I have been really, and one of my things was I wanted to be able to read books in a foreign language, and so French was the one that I chose because that one was more my like academic language. And so I actually really pushed myself, I think it's been probably over a year and a half, maybe even 2 years since I've really started reading books, and I basically just, those first couple of books I had to really just like struggle and like power through, because reading for me is a fun activity, and so it was really, really difficult to feel like I wasn't reading as fast, to feel like I wasn't understanding as much. It was very frustrating. But I managed to push through it, and so every year, well, last year and also this year, I have sub goals in my reading goals for the year for how many books I'd like to read in French. So last year I actually read 15 books in French. This year my goal is to read 15, but ideally I'd like to actually read 20 and read a little bit more in French. And these are not, in lieu of other books, this is part of my total. So for example, part of my 80 books this year, I would like 15 or 20 of them to be in French. So one of the books that I'm currently reading, this is my nighttime read. It is the history of Western languages, which I know I'm a super nerd. This was actually gifted to me by some former colleagues, and they knew me well because I love this book. And this is one that I read a lot of times before I go to bed. It's not one that I just like sit down and read for a long period of time because it's pretty dense. And I've been working on it for honestly like probably 2 years, and I'm finally, so if you see where my bookmark is, it's actually, I don't have that much left because from here back is just like the bibliography. So I've got less than 100 pages to go. So this is the one that I'm like really, this is the year I'm gonna finish this book. So I've been working on this, which has been really great for vocabulary related to languages and just like reading about how you talk about languages in French. So I found that to be really nice. I also try and have a novel that I'm working on. I haven't actually started this one, but this is one that I was also gifted, so it's one I'm going to read. This is a nice short one. I like to read, I tend to not read like doorstopper, like 500-600 page books. I tend to read somewhere in like the 2 to 3, maybe 400 range. And I have a couple of styles of books and a couple of authors that I really enjoy reading in French. One is I love reading Agatha Christie in French because I've read a lot of her books in English. They're nice and short. They follow a structure that I'm familiar with. I understand how like mystery stories work, for example. And so I have been reading a lot of her stuff in French. I've also been branching out. A friend of mine recommended Guillaume Musso, so I've read, I think, 2 of his books so far, and I have a couple more that she lent me that I'm going to work on. And now I'm kind of branching out to other French authors, basically. So this is one that I was gifted, and I'm going to read it. It looks interesting, so that is going to be the next one that I read. I haven't decided if I'm going to wait until I actually finish this book before I start this one, but these are going to be kind of my 2 French books. The other thing is I am not good about reading in Spanish. I'm actually really bad. I have to date only ever read 1 book in Spanish, which is horrible. So one of the things I want to do soon is I'm going to start this book. This is a book I actually bought here in France, and it just looked kind of interesting. It wasn't super long. The way that I pick out books is a lot of times I will just open to a random page where, for example, I don't open to a page that's like only a half page because it's the start of a new chapter. I'm looking to see if I have any like that in here, which I actually don't. But I flip to like the first full page just any random page. And I go through and I try and read it. If I get to, 5 words, if I'm halfway through and I get to about 5 words and I'm like, I really don't understand this, then I was like, okay, that book's too hard, pick another one. I never know all of the words on a page. It's very, very rare unless it's a subject that I'm really familiar with, for example. But if it's a novel, there's a really good chance that I'm not going to know every single word. And the way that I have been able to actually get better at reading is that I don't look up words. So there you have intensive and expansive reading is a terms that I've actually heard before. So with intensive reading, you take your book and anytime you hit a word that you don't know, you look it up. Expansive reading, on the other hand, is where you just read, and if you understand the gist, you try to figure out the words you don't know, but if you really don't, you just kind of skip over it. My one exception is if I come across a word, say like 5 times in a chapter, and I really just have no idea what it is, I'll look it up. But in general, I don't look up words because it breaks my concentration, it stops my forward momentum, and I found that was really keeping me from actually getting better at reading. So that is something I don't have a dictionary next to me when I read. I just kind of go for it, and then if something comes up enough times that it's really like impeding my understanding, then I'll look it up. That's how I read in foreign languages, and that's also how I choose books in foreign languages. So that's that. The other thing is I would like to start reading in Italian. So I got I think it was my birthday or Christmas a couple of years ago, I got these short stories in Italian that are actually that bilingual book. So basically these are bilingual Italian and French. So on the left you have the Italian, on the right you have the French, and then you actually have notes to help explain. So I was gifted this, and so I had been putting off reading it because I didn't feel like my Italian was quite at that level yet, but I want to start with this book, and then once I can get through this, which I imagine it'll take me a while, I have a book of short stories by Agatha Christie that I'm going to work on after that. So I'm kind of working in steps where I've already read a book in Spanish, so I'm just kind of diving into another book in Spanish, but I did choose one that wasn't going to be too crazy out there vocabulary, that kind of stuff. But with Italian, I've never read a book in Italian, and so I'm starting with the bilingual route. And again, I will probably not look at the French side of the page very much because I do understand enough Italian that I'm hoping that I'll be able to kind of read through. But these are designed for language learners, so they tend to use a little bit more simplified vocabulary. For any of the words that are really out there, they tend to have the definition explained in Italian on the one side and often in French on the other side. So I'm hoping that this will help me kind of get over that hump of reading in Italian, and then after that I can move on to reading short stories and then up to, longer things. So the last in the reading section is I have decided recently that I would like to learn German. No particular reason why. I live kind of close to Germany. I have a couple of German-speaking friends on Instagram and, on YouTube and that kind of stuff. And it's really just because German is a language that's kind of come up periodically, and I've never made really good headway just because, I don't know, for whatever reason. So what I'm actually doing is I'm doing German as an experiment. So I found another bilingual book, and this one is actually very, very, very thin because I don't speak German at all. I have very, very little exposure to it. I'm basically starting this one from scratch. And what I want to try and do is, so there's actually a method that's used by Luca Lampariello, which he is an Italian polyglot, and he has a website. I will try and remember to link that down in the description box so you can go and check it out. But one of the things that he does when he learns languages is he uses bidirectional translation. So he basically will get a bilingual book and will work on translating it. Well, I don't know if he always does a bilingual book. I'm using that because I think it's going to be a little bit easier. But essentially, the idea is that you take a text in your target language and you translate it into your native language, for example, and then you read it back, see if it makes sense, and then you try and see if you can translate it back into your target language. I don't know how in-depth I'm going to go to with that, just because I don't know that style of learning is necessarily going to be the most effective for me. However, I thought I would kind of adapt it and try using a bilingual book where it's in German and in French. So obviously neither of those are my native language. We're just going to kind of run with it. But the good news is that because I've read enough in French, I'm hoping that I will be able to kind of make the links easily enough because I'll understand the French. And I'm going to attempt to improve my reading comprehension in German, and then eventually I'd like to get to a point of speaking it, but work on basically the reading comprehension first to learn the basics of the language and learn vocabulary, and then kind of go from there. Now, I don't know if that made a lot of sense. Honestly, it doesn't exactly make sense in my brain yet. I haven't really started. It's just a goal that I have kind of for this year, and so I picked up the book so that I could get to it whenever I wanted to. So those are all of the things that I'm going to, that either I do read in foreign languages or that I would like to start reading in foreign languages. The other thing that I do, as I briefly mentioned, is I try and listen to music in my target languages. Right now I listen to a lot of music in Italian and in Korean because those are the two that I am kind of focusing more on. But I also have a couple of artists that I really like in Arabic. I need to look for some artists in German, but listening to music is one of the ways that I really like to start getting the sounds in my head, and the more advanced I get in the language, the more I then try to understand the actual lyrics and, you know, try and like translate them and figure out what they're actually saying. Whereas when I initially start, it's more just for the sounds, because you know, you have to get that different pronunciation and the different ways that the vowels and the consonants work. And I find for me that the easiest way to kind of break away from English with that is to listen to music in my target language. Let's see, what else did I want to, yes, so my language journal. So because I am kind of focusing, for a while I was letting the language learning kind of go by the wayside because I had university and all that going, but I've been inspired recently, so I want to kind of get back into trying to work on multiple languages at once. So I have a couple of different things that I am using in terms of like notebooky kind of stuff. So first off, I have my Korean stuff, which you guys have already seen inside this guy. This is just a little Nuna, and I essentially have, whoops, I have bookmarks and stuff in here because I was revising. I basically have separated them into, I labeled the Talk to Me in Korean lesson at the top in here. This one I had sample dialogues that I just didn't want to write out because I didn't think I would have enough room, so I just printed it. I also have started a list of verbs, and I will go ahead and do an update of this at some point, but I just want to get a little bit further in so I have more to show you guys. So this is my like lessons where I take notes, and I have my notes from the lessons and from the things that I'm learning, also certain vocabulary, that kind of stuff. Then I have this just little floppy notebook from Hema that I use for writing practice. So as I'm practicing, writing in Hangul, and as I'm trying to learn the actual words, I find that writing them over and over is it's the most helpful way for me. I'm not really big on flashcards. I used to do that when I was in school, and it just doesn't really work for me. I really need to write it in order to really get it in my head, and especially when it's something that has a different alphabet than the one I'm used to. So I just have a little practice notebook that I keep on hand. And then the last thing is I have an actual Korean notebook, which is really cool because somebody on Instagram actually sent this to me because she is a Korean teacher, and she was like, oh, do you have a Korean notebook? I was like, no, I didn't know that was a thing. So she sent me this. So it's super cute. And you'll see it's got like the little timetable. She even did like little sticky notes so I would know what they said. And you'll see in here I filled in that I'm doing verbs, and I actually don't know if that word is entirely correct, but I did write it in English next to it just in case. And what I'm doing is, because I started learning conjugations, I have the infinitive form of the verb, and then I have the present tense, and then I have what it actually means, and I just wrote it in pencil so that I can easily cover that up if I want to practice, like test myself and see if I remember what the words actually stand for. So I left myself with one full page with present tense, and then on the back I have the past tense. So the verbs actually line up. So the verb that's on this line is the same verb that's on, oops, if I can get just the one page to flip, is the same verb that's on this line here, so that I can see both of them. And you'll even notice that I kind of bent the paper, but basically I can, oops, I can flip it here and see the infinitive and then see the past tense. So I did it that way, and you'll see I've got up to the second page. So one thing I do need to do is I need to confirm that I actually conjugated these verbs correctly, but this is going to be my verb book, I think, at this point. Then, more recently, I have started a language journal. So this is just an old moleskin I had lying around. It's one of those that you get in like the pack of 3, and so I just had some extra ones. And so it's just a lined moleskin, but I went ahead and I made these little cards. So I have On the left is my language legend. So I have a little like 1 or 2 letter indicator for the language. So I have French, Spanish, Italian, Korean, Arabic, German, ASL, and cute speech. And then, so that's on the left here. And then on the right, I have the different things that I can do in order to study those languages. And I've got, those are color coded with different Tombow markers. So I have study, read, write, watch, listen, and talk. So basically that, and then I just have my little language journal intro page, and then I set up an index, just a little quick index. I didn't leave very much space, and I set up a monthly log style, so a traditional bullet journal monthly log for February. And what I did is basically I use my legend and my color code in order to mark down what I've done for each day. So if you guys can see here, I'm hoping it's not backwards. If it is, I'll try and input a picture for you guys. But basically I do a little square with whatever color. So for example, anything that's that light gray means I studied. So most of it is I'm studying Korean. It means I reviewed my lessons, or I did a new lesson and talked to me in Korean. Anything that is the dark green means I watched something, and that is mostly also K-dramas. Whoops. Anything that's in the brown there means I read, and that's mostly in French. That's why I've been reading. So this way, I just have a record, and it's pretty, like, it's not super detailed. I don't say how long I did anything, just like what did I do anything that day. But I have a record for which languages I worked on and what I did with those languages. Now, you'll notice there's a ton of repetition because I tend to get obsessive about certain aspects. And so, you know, I've been reading in French for a while, so I do a little bit of that almost every night. But I'm also really obsessed with Korean right now. So I've been doing a lot of studying. I've been doing, you know, listening to music, watching K-dramas, that kind of stuff. But I do also have where, you know, I've listened to music in Spanish and Italian, and I've done, that's basically it. So, you know, right now I'm not focusing on all of the languages every day, but I am at least doing a record of things that I've done to work towards my goals. Now, you will notice that I live in France. I actually am not noting down if I spoke French because there's a really good chance that I spoke French at least a little bit every single day. Like, I don't need to practice it. When I have that talk down, that's if I'm specifically practicing a language. So for example, I don't speak Spanish every day. If I have a conversation with a friend in Spanish, then I would write that down. Or for example, if I were able to talk to somebody in Italian, I would do that. So I'm not going to write down the stuff I do in English because that's my native language. I do stuff with that all the time. I always read whatever. And there's certain things that I'm not going to write down for French because, again, I live in France, so that just is part of my daily life. But other than that, I'm trying to keep track and to see, like, okay, are there certain languages that I'm not doing anything with? Are there certain ways that I'm just not utilizing in terms of how I study? Like, am I really not reading, or am I really not, like, watching things in other languages or what have you? So right now I'm kind of just keeping track of it, and I'm hoping that at the end of the month I'll be able to look and see for March if there are ways that I can sort of target my practice and make it a little bit more structured, I guess. We'll see. It's a work in progress. The other thing I have is I did a second monthly log, and this is for my Hangul, so my word of the day basically, and this is, my friend has decided on her own, she decided 2 days ago that she was going to give me a word of the day, and so I've just been writing them down here so that I can then go back and study them. Now, I have one last thing, and this video is going to be super duper long, guys, because that's just the way I roll, isn't it? So in my actual bullet journal, I wanted to go ahead and show you. I have this language days spread because I had this idea that I was going to focus on, you know, one weekend day to do everything in a certain language. Now, I'm not sure that that's actually going to work because I am all by myself. It would be easier if I had, you know, a polyglot friend and we just decided we were going to spend the day doing this stuff. So I think in some ways it's not necessarily going to be feasible just because I tend to like to jump around to do different things. So I might need to like rethink how I'm going to do this. But I already have this spread here in my bullet journal, and what I was thinking of doing was recopying it and tweaking it and putting it in my language journal. So I actually have a little sticky note here to remind myself that I want to do that. The other thing that I had done for February is I had done a language column in my tracker, so you'll see up here, and then I had done the same color code. This is the exact same color code that I did in my language journal, and I very quickly realized that I didn't leave myself enough room to do more than one language. So basically this month I have been tracking it on the days that I've studied Korean, like just specifically studied. So I either reviewed lessons or did new lessons. And that's how I did it. So I think that next month I'm just not even going to have it in here, and I'm going to just leave it in my language journal and not mess around with it. The other thing that I have in here in the back is, so I have my Talk to Me in Korean tracker. So that is just, I keep track of when I do the lesson. So I actually, I color it in once I've done the lesson and I've written out the notes for them. And I also write the date just so that I can see, you know, how often I did lessons, if I had a big gap of time where I wasn't studying, what have you, and to keep track so I know where I am in the progression. And then the last thing that I have that I haven't done anything with yet, oops, is I have my language days tracking, and this is specifically for TV series or movies that I want to watch in a foreign language. So it's essentially going to be for TV series because that's usually what I watch. But to track, for example, I went through Netflix and I found a couple of different series in Arabic, Spanish, French, Italian, and German that I thought looked interesting. And so what I want to do is, at some point when I can break away from K-dramas and actually start them, I would like to keep track of the episodes. So a lot of these are only like 1 or 2 seasons long, so they're not super long. And so I have a tracker for what the series is, what language it's in, and what episode I'm basically up to. So that is what I have in my bullet journal. Now, you guys might notice that I'm kind of organized, but I'm really not as organized as some people when it comes to language learning, and that is because this is a hobby. I know that whenever I'm put in a situation where I actually need to use the language, I will make a lot more progress. But when I'm just kind of doing it on my own for fun, it's just going to take me so much longer to make the same amount of progress that I would if I had like a structured target in mind. So yeah, definitely kind of take it with a grain of salt. I'm a bit of a hobbyist when it comes to languages. Obviously there are a couple of languages that I like speak fairly proficiently, but I also tend to start a lot of languages and not make as much progress in them as I would like to. So don't let this like kind of system scare you, because honestly these are like my ideas, things that I would like to do but that I haven't necessarily actually put into practice yet. They're just things that I would eventually like to do. This is like the ideal sort of thing. For the last section, tips. I had thought of about 5 kind of main tips. One of the things, and these are tips that you're going to find probably in a bunch of different places. If you look at different polyglot like bloggers, YouTubers, like all that kind of stuff, you're going to see a lot of these tips come up, and these are not tips that I invented. These are tips that I've kind of pulled from different resources that I found from my own practice, what have you. So it's nothing is going to be like ground-shatteringly new or anything like that, but I'll go ahead and leave you with these. So the first thing is, especially for me, I imagine this is true for most people, but in order for me to actually like stick with learning a language, I need to feel some kind of a connection. I don't learn languages because I feel like I have to. I learn languages because I want to. So for example, if there's a language that I feel like I have to learn, unless there's a reason that I'm moving to that country, but like I live in this place and it would be nice to, I don't know, who learns languages like that? Probably no one. But basically, there are certain languages that I don't feel as much of a draw to learn. So unless, for example, I met somebody and, you know, made a friend who spoke that language and that changed my perception of it and it changed the connection I feel with the language, then there are certain languages I probably won't learn. Now, like I said, that's not to say I never want to learn those languages, but the thing that actually pushes me to start learning a language is some kind of a connection. So, gotta find the connection first. Second thing is, find ways to incorporate it into your daily life. So you guys know, for example, I have been really focusing on Korean lately, so I do my bullet journal in Korean. All of my headers and stuff I do in Korean. I don't do my tasks just because I don't have the vocabulary yet, but I do as much as I can in Korean. I, you know, watch TV in Korean. I listen to K-pop, for example. I try to find ways to incorporate it into my daily life. For other languages that I speak, for example, I talk to myself. Let's be honest, I do. I talk to myself constantly, and I use a rotation of all of my languages. So some days there are literally times where I'm walking down the street muttering to myself, and I'll switch from Spanish to French to signing to like a couple things in Italian and like go back through. And I use that to help me practice. So yeah, I try to do something, even if it's not like officially studying, I try to do something in some of my languages every day, basically. The third one is, it really helps having some sort of accountability. So for example, I am not studying Korean with my friend, like we're both doing it independently, but I feel this kind of accountability because I see the progress that she's making and how much more she's able to understand K-dramas, and I feel motivated to continue that myself. Now, this is definitely the one that I fall short on. I am not always good about holding myself accountable or finding an accountability buddy with certain languages. You know, for something like French, obviously I'm accountable because I live in France, I have to. But for other ones, it's a little bit harder, but it's one thing that I do notice that if I have that, I do better and I work harder and I make more progress in the language. The next thing, number 4, is before you buy stuff, look for resources online. There are certain things that I will end up buying. For example, I have books in foreign languages because I find, even though I have a Kindle, I find that physically holding a book in a foreign language just works a little bit better for me. I, to this day, have not read an ebook in any language other than English. I don't know what it is. There's some kind of a weird mental block, but for me, I need to have physical books if I'm going to read in a foreign language. So that's one of those things that I do buy. I try not to get sucked into buying too many like manuals or like language learning programs. I do have a library card here, so I try and find them in the library first. I try to find equivalent sort of resources online. There's so many free online things. I mean, you've got Talk to Me in Korean for Korean. You've got, for Italian, I used Learn Italian with Lucrezia. Like there's tons of resources out there that you can find if you look for them. The other thing that's really good is to try and find a couple of the websites that are from like polyglots, because they'll tend to have links for lots of different resources. But Google is your best friend. Like just definitely, unless it's something that you really feel strongly that's going to help you, there's no need to spend a ton of money on language learning, at least not at first. Maybe once you get a little bit further into it, that makes sense. But at least first off, especially if you're not sure how it's going to go, try to find stuff online that's free first. And then the last thing, number 5, is figure out what works for you. I mentioned earlier, I'm not a grammar person. I also need to have stuff written down. So for example, flashcards don't really work for me because writing it down one time and then just looking at it doesn't work. What I find that works for me is I need to have a notebook where I can just write over and over and over. And for example, there are certain words in Korean that are just like in my brain now because I just constantly write them over and over. Part of that has to do with the fact that I have a very limited vocabulary and so I only know a couple of words, but it also really helps me get those certain words in my brain. And especially learning something that has a different alphabet than what you're used to, having that repetition of writing in that new alphabet makes such a difference. And it also, for example, when I was learning Hangul, I'm still not 100% sure on all the vowels. Like I'm good on the consonants, I'm not 100% sure on the vowels. But the fact that I am writing in Hangul when I'm doing my vocabulary, even if I do have the romanization under to kind of remind me, I'm trying to get to where I'm reading the Hangul to like help myself learn that. And I'm finding that there are certain vowels that I'm now much more comfortable with than I was at the beginning, just through repetition. The other thing is, can you study on your own? Are you self-motivated enough to do that? Do you need to have a class? Do you need to have at least a tutor? Do you need a language buddy? For example, I know that for me, I make a lot more progress when I have a structured class when I'm in like the A1, A2 level. So basically when I'm a beginner, just to kind of make sure I'm starting off on the right foot. That's not to say that I always do that, but I also know that through experience, that works. Once I hit an intermediate level, the classes become super boring. I want nothing to do with them anymore. Like, sure, I know that they're going to be helpful, but I would much rather, try and read or listen to music or watch TV or do things like that on my own and develop my skills more that way. But I also know that for beginners, it is really useful for me to have a class. So it's just basically figuring out like which ways work. And there's so many different methods that people talk about online, especially, like I said, check out some of the polyglots out there because they've done this a lot of times and they have a lot of insight into how that works and especially how it works for them. So if you take all of the different advice that they have and kind of pick through it and figure out what's going to work for you, that's going to be so much better for helping you actually make progress. And that's one of those things that, I have people who are like, oh yeah, you should do this, you should do this. And sometimes like, yeah, that's awesome. That sounds like a great idea. I never thought of that. And sometimes I'm like, yes, I know that this works for a lot of people, but I also know that it does not work for me. So to each his own, everybody's got their own style of learning. So I know that this was another super long video, and like I said, I'm not an expert. I do not know everything or even most things about learning languages. I just hope that by kind of giving you an idea on as to how I go about it, maybe you will have some like tips or tricks or inspiration that you will take away from this to help in your own language study. So I hope you enjoyed the video, and I will hopefully be back in the future with more vlogs. If you guys have an idea for a specific vlog topic, leave it down in the comment section. If you have any comments or questions, definitely leave them down below. If I get enough specific questions about language learning, I might do a follow-up to this vlog to try and answer some of those. So you never know. And I hope you guys have a great day. Bye.